So the reason why the scientists in Brave New World actually don't use any genetic engineering is because the idea of genetic engineering hadn't been discovered, or even it was not a glimmer in anybody's brain at the time this book was written. And it's because the DNA had not been discovered at all. DNA was discovered in the 1940s. Aldous Huxley wrote Brave New World in the 1930s. Okay, so the scientists in this book don't do genetic engineering. They do something called selective breeding. So selective breeding is a lot like what it sounds like. It's where you decide, hey, I really like this one trait. I wonder if we can make more organisms with that same trait. But I don't understand what genes are, so can I do it in a way that doesn't involve DNA? Because I don't know what that is yet. So, for example, if I have, this is Kiwi, okay? If I want lots of cats that look like Kiwi, I'm going to make sure he is put out to stud and is going to be mating with a whole lot of other cats, so we get a lot of baby cats that look like Kiwi. Okay, that's selective breeding. It's very simple as long as it works, because sometimes we do selective breeding and we don't get the traits we want because that's just not how the evolution or how the fertilization works, because evolution decided it's not going to happen that way. So let's look at some examples where selective breeding has really helped humans develop as a species. Without these, a couple of these, without these, we would probably not have been as successful as an organism as we are now. A couple of them are ridiculous and hilarious, and so they show some of the downsides to selective breeding that people don't expect. So let's take a look. All right, so selective breeding. Selective breeding is where we breed organisms to bring out very specific traits. So there's a species of wild mustard where over time people decided, hey, I really like the leaves on this thing. I'm going to breed, every time I find a plant with bigger leaves, I'm going to breed it with another of these plants with bigger leaves until the leaves get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and we end up with something that we eat every day. And same thing with the stem of this, the what are called lateral buds and the terminal buds, the stems on some of the other flowers, some of the flower clusters, and it may surprise you to learn that there are 6 vegetables that are very common. They come from one I guess it's an old plant that looks very, very different when we do selective breeding to it. And that is all of the, what are they called? The cuciniform? Something like that. Cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, which I know is really popular in Israel, but I don't see a lot in the States. Kale, broccoli, cauliflower. All of these things are literally the exact same species. It's just we bred out certain parts of them because people decided, hey, if we find a mutant that has a really big flower and we breed it with other mutants with big flowers, we get broccoli. If we have a different kind of flower and we breed it with the same mutant that we see in another of them, we get cauliflower instead. Whoa! Oh, kale comes from this. What? And so you see that selective breeding can actually lead to very different offspring, at least over many different generations. So we see this in chickens. Chickens have been bred to get bigger and bigger over time. This chicken looks a lot more like the wild chicken, if you can imagine wild chicken, than the chicken we see. This isn't even the chicken we see today. What do they look like today? Not in this image. Okay. So again, we took chickens and we bred them with other chickens that got bigger and bigger, so they made more meat, right? The kind of classic example is the idea of the wolf. So over time, wolves that speaking of wolves, my dog thinks he's a guard dog. Over time, sorry about that. My own little house wolf was freaking out. So over time, wolves there were certain wolves that had mutations in their personality that allowed them to become friendlier with humans, and then humans got closer to wolves, and then the breeding happened so that the friendly wolves were breeding with other friendly wolves, and over thousands of years, we get animals that don't look like wolves. We get dogs, okay? And it's gotten to such a point where we get things like pugs that are so far off from their wild type ancestor, the wolf. Technically, the wolf could still breed, and it still sometimes does breed with all of the different dog species. They're still the same species by technical terms in that they can interbreed, but if you look at a pug and a wolf, do you consider them the same species? Technically, they could interbreed, but would they? The pug is so it's so different from its wild type that if you look at its skull, first of all, that the nose is pushed in so much, because that's just the trait people like when they look at pugs, that they can't breathe. They have a lot of nasal issues, and their hips are so small that they can't even give birth anymore. Now, if this were a wild animal, it would go extinct from not being able to give birth. Okay, so selective breeding does have these mishaps that happen sometimes. It's just that in the case of the pug, we're cool with it. We like it. They're so cute when they make snuffly noises. Well, that snuffly noise might be killing your dog, but cool, whatever. Let's look at the cow. So wild type cows look more like this. This is a Brahma bull. But we bred them with cows so that they would do certain things for us, right? So we bred them with we had a mutant cow originally that made really good meat. And so they started breeding it with other mutants that made good meat or whatever. Or the cow with a mutant gene that made it lactate constantly instead of just when it was feeding its own young. So then we get dairy cows. And then we have these Highland cows that just look really cute. And it turns out we like that. And so this is a big tourist attraction in, I think, Scotland. So we've bred out the things in cows that we like. So they all come from one original species, but they definitely look very different today. Could these animals survive in the wild? Most likely not, because a lot of times when we domesticate an animal, we also breed out its aggression. And so if it ever did encounter a wild animal, it would probably get killed. Okay, so that is another downside, or it could be you can consider an upside to domestication in that the wild behaviors are lost. Okay, one downside to this is sometimes you get very crazy mutants, like this cow that was bred to be a milking cow, but somehow also got growth genes involved and is so large that it got saved from a slaughterhouse because it literally would not fit in a slaughtering machine. Okay, so don't think too much about that. The problem was it gets so big that physics hasn't caught up, or the evolution of this animal it's kind of being, it's outside of evolution in that it's domesticated, and the physics of its organs haven't caught up with the physics of its muscles, okay? So the idea being it's so big that its heart can't beat hard enough and fast enough to keep it oxygenated, and the heart eventually fails. And also all the joints in these really big animals that we domesticate this way are really weak in comparison to what they should be, and they end up hurting the animal, and they get cancers and they get heart disease, and so that's one of those problems. So if you're sad about that, I have one more fun example, and that is the rabbit. So if you look at wild rabbits, that's what they are. But over time, people have realized that you can breed certain mutant rabbits that have really fuzzy fur, and you get Angoras. And again, would these survive in the wild? Absolutely not. But at some point, someone said, look at this cool mutant. I want to breed it with another one that looks sort of like it, and I'm going to keep breeding it so that I get certain traits, okay? Now, that's exactly what Brave New World, the introductory science part of Brave New World is all about. They've decided on traits they like in humans, and they want to just breed those. Now, in the first video for this, we talked about the Genetic Virtue Project, and people talk about that might not be a bad idea. What if we decided that only smart people should be allowed to have babies? What if only fit people were allowed to have babies? And it's like, okay, cool, calm down, Hitler. That's not okay. You can't decide who. Once we start letting people decide that only certain people can reproduce, we start to limit. You get even more prejudice than there already is in the world, and we do not need that. Okay, so let's go back a step and talk about. I know someone had a question about can you have can you have a fatherless baby? And it actually turns out you can. So this does, and we'll bring us back to Brave New World in a second. So in Brave New World, they actually talk a lot about how they harvest ova, they harvest eggs, and they bathe them in they call it a liquor, or a bouillon. They call it a bouillon, which is a soup or mixed soup of spermatozoa, which is just another way to say sperm. And over time, all the eggs should get fertilized by the sperm. But there actually is a case in nature where we do see an animal that is an entirely female species. There are no males at all, and they do something called, this is the whiptail lizard in, I believe it's Arizona. It's actually a hybrid of two different lizard species, and at some point, instead of going through what's a normal lizard life cycle, which is where you have, we're going to pretend that we're all lizards in this case, you have female lizard mating with a male lizard, so a female egg and mating with a male egg, or male sperm, getting to a baby lizard. Some point in evolution, the males died. and no males means no sperm. And this should be a point in evolution where in this animal's development where the species goes extinct, because no males, no sperm. That means who's going to fertilize these eggs? Because whenever, usually during the production of eggs in any kind of species, you get half the number of chromosomes, and if you keep doing that over and over, you end up with 0 chromosomes at the end. So it's very there are a lot of systems in place in fertilization process, in any kind of, let's see, in fetal development, to make sure the right number of chromosomes are present, or else development does not happen. But somehow, this tricky little lizard, there was one female mutation where instead of going through mitosis, which takes the parental cell and cuts the chromosomes number in half so that they can then be combined with the same number of chromosomes from the male, instead of doing meiosis, they do mitosis, which means instead of having half the number of chromosomes, they have the same number of chromosomes. And so instead of getting fertilized by a sperm, which would then bring it back up to the right number, they're just already at the right number. And so instead of so the whole point of bringing an egg and a sperm together is you mix genes. Okay, so you get you have 2 copies of each gene, and then whichever gene is dominant, depending, there's much more complicated things, but that's good enough for you to know for now. Whichever one's dominant gets presented. Okay, so for example, I have blue eyes because I got a recessive gene from my mom that was blue and a recessive gene from my dad that was blue. My dad had brown eyes because he had one dominant brown eye gene from his dad, my grandpa, but he had a recessive blue eye gene from my grandmother. And so I got that gene got passed down. I got passed down from my mom, who had blue eyes, so she only had recessive genes. I ended up with 2 blue recessive genes. I have blue eyes, okay? Okay, so that's fast and dirty genetics, right? So in the case of this lizard, you don't get any of that recombination. There's no recombination. There's no pairing of chromosomes. So instead of getting a new and unique set of genes, you get a clone. Okay, so this entire species of lizards, they're all female. They're all the exact same organism. They're just clones over and over and over. Okay, now for now, it's fine for this lizard because as long as the environment doesn't change, these clones are all perfectly adapted for the environment they live in. So that's just a fun, weird example. And it goes a little bit further, because it turns out the only way to get this lizard to develop an egg and then lay it is to have another one of the lizards pretend to be male. So these are both females of this species, because the subspecies only has females. But in order for one to lay an egg, the other one has to go through male mating dances, basically. So the one pretending to be male has a spike in testosterone, or whatever the lizard equivalent of testosterone is, and it starts doing this little sexy lizard mating dance, and then the lady lizard's like, oh yeah, I like this, and she lays an egg. But she won't do it if this female pretending to be a male or a pseudo-male doesn't do the dance. And so it's this weird thing in evolution where you actually see that behavior can influence the hormone production in another organism. And that's an interesting example of how specific signals can lead to a huge change in another organism, or even the same organism, which we'll talk about in a second. Okay, but let's go back to this idea of that if you notice, there is a huge gap between when we have the zygote, no matter how you got to the zygote. Remember, a zygote is just a fertilized egg. So it could be an egg and a sperm have come together, or it could be this example from the lizard, where this one specific lizard, where you just get clones of the same egg over and over. But either way, we're at the single cell level. This zygote is ready to make an embryo. And then suddenly, in every introductory biology book, suddenly it's a baby. So you went from one cell to billions of cells with no explanation. Well, it turns out this is a very complicated process. If you're going from a single cell to a baby that will eventually grow up to a complicated organism, some stuff needs to happen first, okay? So actually, between the single cell and the complicated organism, you have a series of divisions of those cells, okay? So the zygote divides once, and you get this 2-cell stage. You get both of these cells divide, you get the 4 cells, etc., 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 until you get to what's called the blastocyst, where suddenly the cells aren't just dividing in half, certain cells are doing certain things. Now, if you're a lizard, like our friends, these guys, or ladies, sorry, these are all ladies, you're going to be doing something called oviparity. or you're oviparous, sorry. And so what that means is you, at this stage, or a little bit before this stage, there is an organ in all of the egg-bearing organisms that will coat this in shell, and then the organism will lay the egg. Okay, so that's why it's called oviparity or oviparous, because this means egg bearing. Okay, so parus means bearing and ovi means egg. Okay, now there is a question of what comes first, the chicken or the egg, and we know the answer to that question. The answer to that question is the egg came first, laid by something that wasn't a chicken, because we know that chickens are related to T-Rexes, so there was a point in evolutionary history where a T-Rex laid an egg that had so many mutations in it that it eventually led to something that was a chicken. So that question is over. So get a better analogy, people. Okay, so cool. Be quiet. Get back on task, Megan. All right, here we go. In the case of anything that does not lay eggs, you have something called viviparity or live birth, and that's where once you hit that blastostage phase, okay, so everything else is the same. You have the cell, the egg and the sperm come together, except when it's super crazy cloning situation, and this just doubles itself. And has this happened in humans? Probably. We just haven't recognized it. It's just not very common, and it's the sexual reproduction is so beneficial. Not calm down, 15-year-old brains. It's beneficial because you get such a good combination of genes that protects you from different diseases that it's this is much more successful evolutionarily. Okay, so what happens in the live birth? So instead of at the stage where you would get coated in the eggshell and laid, you just keep developing, and by laid I mean laid, being laid. Okay, calm down. You just keep developing, and you'll notice there are these stages where we sort of look like a fish, and we sort of look like a lizard. And if this were more detailed and continuing, you would see we finally start looking more and more like a baby human way down the line. But we go through these stages of what's called ontology, which is at the beginning of this lecture. Where we look like the organisms we evolved from in the past. And it's way too complicated to talk about right now, but it's a way to study evolution is to study fetal development. Oh, exciting, you guys. Okay, so cool. What else? Okay, right. Let's talk about the uterus. So all of this is happening if you're a mammal in the uterus, okay? If you are not a mammal, but if you're a possum, if you're a marsupial, you don't have a uterus. What you do instead is you literally at about this phase, except you have gigantic arms in comparison, you leave the it's sort of a kind of pseudo uterus. You crawl out of the individual and you crawl up the pouch of the mother. You crawl up the mother and you climb into a pouch which basically acts like a uterus. So it's not like a little pocket that you can like put your keys in. It's a squishy, blood rich, nutrient rich place for the fetus to develop. Okay, in the placental mammals, so all the other mammals that aren't like the marsupials, we have a uterus. Now, for a long time, people thought the uterus was basically like the bladder. It's just a big empty sac, and it holds some stuff, and maybe some stuff happens, and then you get rid of it, and it's fine. Okay, that is not true. We now are very cognizant that the uterus is actually a very complicated not organism, because what it has to do is it has to be constantly ready to get a fertilized egg and let that fertilized egg settle into it, and then it responds to the fact that it has a fertilized egg settled into the wall by interdigitizing with the outer layer of the fertilized egg and creating the placenta, and then the placenta has to grow a certain way, and the placenta has to be attached to the mother, and oh my gosh, you guys, it's so complicated. And what people also may not know, and close your eyes if you don't like squishy pictures, but the uterus is this very, the lining of the uterus is so thick. Like a lot of this is muscle. So if you ever get cramps, it's because these muscles are squishing to get rid of the internal layers because, we didn't get pregnant this time. We'll get rid of it. We'll do it again next time. Okay, and it's just this uterus is so complicated, which is why I think it's hilarious in Brave New World when they talk about to create a fake uterus, they use a peritoneum of a sow, a pig peritoneum. So what's a peritoneum? So the peritoneum is, the peritoneal cavity is where all of our guts are. Okay, so all of our major organs besides the heart, the lungs, and the kidneys exist within the peritoneum. Okay, now the peritoneum is the membrane that holds it all in place. It's basically biological saran wrap. That's it. It doesn't do anything. It's just saran wrap. And in Brave New World, he uses this idea that, well, what if you can take this this lining and add certain hormones to it, and then it becomes a pretend uterus. And that's interesting. It's not good science. I mean, it's not science that has ever proven to work. I think there's only been one proven case where someone transplanted a uterus into someone else and they gave birth. I think that just happened literally last month. But in the 30s, when they were thinking of ideas of how do you make babies in bottles and make it work, it's good for the time. Okay, so let's now that you know the very quick and dirty version of how fetuses develop, let's talk a little bit about some of the stuff that may be a little more tricky in the first chapter. Okay, so the super society wants to make super babies. They talk about in the incubation room or in the hatchery that ova are being incubated at 37 degrees or blood heat, which is the same thing as saying body temperature. So 37 degrees Celsius is body temperature, but sperm have to be kept at a slightly less than blood heat, so slightly less than body temperature, and that is why testes exist outside of your body, because they evolution just figured out eventually that your sperm are more successful when they're slightly cooler than your body temperature. Okay, so one thing I think is interesting in this book is, I don't know if he does it on purpose as commentary on sexism at the time, or if he just had some internalized sexism, but Aldous Huxley talks about how they check the ova for and the ovaries that they collect for abnormalities several times, so many times, but they never check the sperm. And that's interesting because it's actually a lot easier to get malformed sperm than it is to get an abnormal egg. Okay, and actually even now when we look to see what an abnormal egg looks like, it's really hard to see if there's something wrong with the egg. It's very easy to see if there's something wrong with the sperm. So these are normal sperm. These are sperm where they have multiple heads. They have weird tails that don't work. They're just doing something that's not going to work. Okay, so sperm are made literally every single day, starting from puberty through death. The eggs are, however, all made before women are born. So if you're a female, a biological female, you have made all the eggs you will ever have before you're even born out of your mom. So baby Noel here has all the eggs she will ever have before she leaves Noel's mom. Okay? Crazy. Bananas. Oh, brain hurting. Why? Because that's just what evolution decided worked best. Okay? Cool. So let's go on. So what does it mean by egg abnormality? All we can look at for egg abnormality right now is how many chromosomes does it have. So if you ever do an amniocentesis, or if you've ever known someone to do an amniocentesis, what they do is they take uterine fluid out of someone. This can be very dangerous because if you do this, you have to go into the uterus, and you have to rupture the cervix lining, and then you have to rupture the placental lining. You have to rupture some uterine lining. You rupture, and anytime you disturb this environment, you could suddenly cause a spontaneous abortion, and that's no good. You can cause a miscarriage. Okay, so amniocentesis is not always the best way to go, but what it does is it lets you collect cells. So you collect some zygotic cells that have been shed as they've been used up, and you can look and see what do the chromosomes look like. So if you take out a nucleus, you can get the chromosomes when they're in. I have to think about what the phases are called, if it's mat. So metaphase, when they've condensed, and then you start arranging them by size and certain banding colors. And you can look and you can say, okay, so we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. The first 22 are all somatic, so they control everything. Basically, all we care about is these are somatic and these are the sex chromosomes. Okay, so we have 2 X chromosomes, so this must be a female. Okay, cool. Let's keep looking. I should have 1 chromosome from mom, 1 from dad. Doesn't matter which one's which, as long as we have 2 from each. We do until we get to this, and this is the 21st chromosome. So it has 3. So we call this trisomy 21, and this is a Down syndrome fetus. Okay, so that's what amniocentesis tells you. It can give you a confirmation of what sex your baby is, and if you have chromosomal abnormalities, okay, such as Down syndrome. So what this is people like to say, oh, if you do this, and you're automatically telling people to kill babies, brr. And that's again a case where people are trying to pretend that they know science to push their belief. Anyway, what doctors do this for is to prepare parents, so if they do go through with pregnancy, they are better informed with how to take care of this baby. Okay. All right, so let's look at a couple other. These are called karyotypes, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that. Okay, so here's an example where we don't have trisomy 21, but we do have 3 sex chromosomes. So we have 2 X's and a Y. And that's to be considered female at the chromosomal level, you need an X and 2 X's. To be considered male at the chromosomal level, you need an X and a Y, but now we have both. So what happens? And Klinefelter syndrome is where you have intermediate sexual organs, you don't go through puberty properly, many other things happen, including something happening to intelligence that shows us that it's more complicated than just having a Y chromosome or having 2 X chromosomes. Something is interacting here which creates something else, right? And it's not a bad thing. You can still go on and have a perfectly happy life as someone with Klinefelter's. Same thing with Turner syndrome, where you just have 1 X chromosome. It's just something to be aware of if you ever do a chromosomal study. Okay, what else is happening here? In Brave New World, they talk about something called the Bokanovsky process, okay? So the Bokanovsky process is where they say, first of all, the alphas and the betas, because there's several classes of humans, alphas and betas are allowed to develop as normal, okay? So they just go through, they do their thing. The gammas, deltas, and epsilons go through the Bokanovsky process. So let me read this. And the Bokanovsky process is based on the idea of twins. Okay, so Aldous Huxley took this idea of how twins work, where, this is not the slide I want, it's fine. So if you have identical twins, what happens is so here's our zygote where the egg and sperm have come together, and it started reproducing, or the zygote started going through development to make fetus, and at some point, the egg split, or it's not the egg because it's fertilized, these fertilized eggs split. So it might be at the 2-cell level, it might be at the blastocyst level. If it gets further along than blastocyst, usually something weird happens, and weird things happen. So usually it's very early on in this stage, okay? If you're an identical twin, it's basically where an egg splits in half. So if we're at the 16-cell level and we get twinning, all of a sudden we have 2 8-cell levels, 2 8-cell stage embryos, and then they just keep oh my goodness, I'm losing words. They just keep going through the process as normal, but now there's 2 of them. Now in Brave New World, he talks about how in the Bokanovsky process they do this, but they do it right before the blastocyst stage, and they do it like 96 times for one fertilization situation, okay? And so and they make a point of saying, oh, that's as good as we can do, but the Japanese do it so much better, and we're trying to catch up. It's very much like an arms race, kind of not arms race, some sort of like, you guys, I know science, I don't know like that kind of stuff, but basically they're trying to be the best at human fertilization and incubation and everything. Okay, and so it basically they get to the stage, this breaks in half, and then suddenly they have 2 that are developing, and then those 2 break in half, and then they have 4, and then they have 8, and then they have et cetera, until they get to 96, and that's as many times as they can go into breaking that one fertilization event into 2 new individuals. Now, there's so much more I could talk about with this, and I'm so happy to if you want to come talk to me. He talks about, when he's talking about the uterus, he talks about thyroxin and placentum, which thyroxin is a hormone, placentum is not a hormone. We can talk about it, come talk to me about it, but I don't want to take your entire class, so I'm going to stop my chapter 1 talk now. There will be a video in the future about the science involved in chapter 2, because it's fascinating and terrifying what they're doing in the book, and there's many cool examples from biology where this stuff happens naturally that are interesting things to compare to this. Okay, enjoy.